Good day, History 361. So today we're going to be talking about women in ancient Greece. In many ways, this is not a happy story. Ancient Greece was a society that was profoundly patriarchal in orientation and deeply misogynistic in its mindset. Now, this is of course true of many pre-modern societies. Some of that, unfortunately, has to do with demographics, and it's perhaps worthwhile starting off with the demographics of women in ancient Greece. We know demographic statistics imperfectly, but in some respects we can reconstruct what ancient Mediterranean demographics might have looked like using more complete evidence from other agricultural pre-modern societies for which we have records. Overall, a key tragic aspect of demography in pre-modern society is the extraordinary rate of infant mortality. Children sadly die frequently. They die in infancy, and then they continue to die from a whole host of childhood diseases, really up until about the age of 10 or 12. And one consequence of this just horrifying plague that strikes children from the moment they're born, really up until they're just about to hit puberty, is that women need to have many children simply for the society to maintain its current population. The best estimate of demographers, and again these are estimates, is that in a pre-modern society, a society like the ancient Mediterranean, a woman probably needs to have between 5 and 7 children just so 2 can reach adulthood. And this, of course, is an extraordinary burden that is placed on the women. They have to be constantly either pregnant or lactating, basically for almost all of their fertile years. Physically, this is very, very difficult. Death in childbirth is a danger that haunts women throughout the pre-modern age and, frankly, beyond. We even have evidence of that famously from the tragedy Medea by the playwright Euripides. And Medea famously says, "I would rather stand 3 times with a shield in battle than give birth once." A rather stark way of thinking about the routine physical dangers that women face simply in the quest to reproduce the population. It also means that women are going to, again, pay this extraordinary physical tax, but it makes it very difficult for them to actually claim a space in public life. Now, obviously, the patriarchal orientation of society, the misogynist mindset, restricts them. But in many ways, it's difficult for women to even try to claw a place in public life because they are largely committed from roughly the time of first menses until menopause with being pregnant, with nursing, with taking care of children, and this fact alone relegates them to the domestic sphere. In many instances, it makes it harder for them to try to assert themselves in political or economic or social life. Now, some women do, but this is going to be an extraordinary burden that all ancient women, really all pre-modern women, face. Even so, I think it's possible to say that overall, women in ancient Greece have it worse than even women in other pre-modern societies. Precisely because of aspects of Greek culture, and especially Athenian culture, that are fundamentally misogynistic. Some of you have taken my courses in the Roman Republic or Roman Empire, and I think one thing to simply take away is that Roman women, in terms of their legal prerogatives, have it much better. When it comes to their control over property and other factors. Roman women who face the same horrific demographic burdens nonetheless have more rights and more agency than women in classical Greece. So there are also just choices that are made. Now, there is going to be some variation in the status of women in Greek societies as well. I think one thing that is fair to say is that oftentimes the status of women is somewhat determined by their overall status in the social hierarchy. So if we go to, say, Sparta, and its, of course, quite rigid social pyramid, helot women have almost no rights. It seems that sort of sexual abuse or sexual exploitation of helot women is a kind of grim fact of Spartan domination. But if we work our way up the social chain, Spartiate women have quite a lot of rights. In fact, they probably are some of the highest status women in all of Greece, because the Spartans have what probably could be called a eugenic ideology. They were kind of obsessed about the strength and vigor of this narrow class of Spartiates. Spartan women are encouraged to exercise physically. Great attention is paid to their physical health in the hope that they will be stronger wives who will bear stronger children. And it's not just the fact that Spartan women are able to go out in public, to exercise, to engage in athletic competitions. They also have some of the sort of most robust property rights anywhere in Greece. They can inherit property and control the property that they inherit. And other Greeks actually find this remarkable and even say things like, well, gosh, the Spartans are just run by their women, because they allow women to not only inherit, but to actually exert direct control over their inheritances. But in many ways, the role of the status of these Spartan women come from the fact that they are involved in this narrow band at the very top of Spartan society, and they're not necessarily representative of women in Greece. Now, in Athens, with the advent of the democracy, there is a new egalitarian ideology that now applies to all male Athenian citizens. And I think it's fair to say that this is actually quite bad for women, in that, or at least women who before might have enjoyed some status based on their rank in society, aristocratic women, perhaps women like the rich Athenian woman, the 10th century burial of Clearly was a very important person in her family and even within the broader society. But once you have an egalitarian ideology for all males in the demos, this is going to really knock all women down. And indeed, probably Athens is actually one of the worst places to be a woman anywhere in Greece, because even higher status women, even women who are associated with wealthier families, really don't have the rights or agency that they might find in a less democratic place. Indeed, one of the most common monuments in democratic Athens, it eventually becomes popular elsewhere, but seems to originate in democratic Athens, is the Herm. Now, a Herm is basically a boundary stone that features the head of the god Hermes. Hermes is the god of boundary crossing, of border crossing. That's one reason why he's the god who takes souls down to the underworld, is that he's guiding them through the crossing of this boundary between life and death. So the Herm is a boundary marker. And in Athens, almost every household, every oikos, has a Herm to mark the entryway to the house. There are also Herms that mark the border between city-states as well. But the Herm doesn't just have a head, the head of Hermes, it also has an extraordinary large erect phallus on it. And on one hand, this is clearly a warning to those who would cross the boundary. It may have certain apotropaic elements, but I think it's hard not to see this as a expression of what is a fundamentally masculinist ideology about male power, male prerogatives, male domination even. And that starts off even outside the household, proclaiming the male prerogatives and domination of the oikos. Now, again, These things start in Athens, although they do become more popular over many other parts of Greece. And some historians have associated the sort of explosion of the use of herms as actually an expression of the democracy. Again, the confidence of Athenian males over their property, their city-state. Again, in this ideology where sort of the sign of agency, the sign of control is literally an erect phallus, that certainly is an extraordinary ideological statement that must not have been lost on the women in that society. Indeed, one modern historian, the feminist historian Eva Cools, has argued that the Athenian democracy should in fact be termed the reign of the phallus, one of the more provocatively titled books on Greek history. Now, Greek sexual morality was characterized by an extraordinary divergence of expectations for women and men. Women faced quite stringent expectations for sexual morality. It was expected that they would remain virgins up until the point of marriage, and then would only experience sexual intercourse within marriage. Adultery was not just frowned on, but in Athens, men continued to claim the legal right to murder any adulterer that they caught within their house. Men, on the other hand, were allowed extraordinary latitude even within marriage. There is a famous quote from an Athenian court case in which the speaker, sometimes referred to as Pseudo-Demosthenes, claims that we have courtesans for pleasure, prostitutes for the body's daily needs, and lawful wives for the bearing of legitimate children and the guardianship of our houses. This speaker, who was speaking before a jury comprised entirely of Athenian men, assumes that even a married man will treat his wife largely as a sexual means of generating lawful children and someone who takes care of his house, but will then look to other women for various levels of sexual and romantic solace. Now, for Greek men, the women who provided extramarital sex existed on a spectrum. On the far end of the spectrum were common prostitutes, pornai, that's where we get our term pornography. Essentially women with whom you might engage in strictly transactional sex, usually as a one-time transaction. In the middle were mistresses, palakai, and these seem to be women who were kept women, but were kept primarily for the purposes of sex. At the far end of the spectrum were a class of women known as hetairae, companions. These women were women with whom men engaged in sexual relationships. But hetairae were more than just sex partners, more than just mistresses. These were frequently women who had a great deal of human capital. They were beautiful, yes, but they also could play musical instruments. They could engage in witty or philosophical conversation. They were interested in art and literature and politics even. And many hetairae were migrants. They came from other parts of the Aegean world. A large number of them actually come from Thrace. And oftentimes, they are actually elite women in their own societies who have migrated to Greece, especially to Athens, to seek their kind of fortunes through relationships with elite Greek men. Now, these women frequently turned up in sympathetic contexts, not just because they're sexy, but again, because they have this human capital, because in the context of a symposium, again, a context which wives are banished from, these women can play musical instruments, engage in conversation, tell funny stories, talk philosophy or politics. It does not seem uncommon that oftentimes for an elite Greek male, his primary romantic connection is not to his wife, but to a hetaira. After all, Greek marriages are predominantly marriages of convenience because of two families of the same social status or economic level find it useful to marry. They are not love marriages. They're fundamentally arranged marriages, either between the two families arranging for both the husband and wife, or the husband arranging the marriage with the father of the bride. When Greek men, elite Greek men at least, fall in love, they tend to fall in love with hetaira. And it's not uncommon for the kind of primary romantic emotional relationship of an elite man to be with his courtesan. Now, this creates problems. In many instances, these are long-term, maybe not quite monogamous, but long-term romantic relationships, and oftentimes they result in children. Not infrequently, if they can, elite Greek men will try to marry their hetaira and even pass them off as their lawful wedded wife. Now, in Athens, up until 451, this is actually perfectly legal. There's nothing to stop an Athenian man from marrying a foreigner and then having legitimate children with her. Themistocles, the great general at Salamis, had a Thracian mother. In 451, however, the statesman Pericles, and this in many ways is part of these radical democratic reforms, passes a citizenship law in Athens. And the citizenship law mandates that in order to become an Athenian citizen, both your father and your mother must be Athenian citizens. This is probably a radical law because it actually targets elite men who up until now had quite frequently been having children with hetairai, foreign hetairai, and had then sought to pass those children off as their legitimate heirs. And up until 451, there was actually no legal injunction to stop them from doing that. So after 451, you now need to have a natural-born Athenian mother and an Athenian father. Now, incidentally, one person who runs afoul of this citizenship law is none other than Pericles. As an elite Greek male, he has a wife who he frankly doesn't really care for, who he's largely married because she's wealthy and from a good family. But he's in love with his hetaira, a supposedly brilliant, witty woman named Aspasia. And he has a child with his hetaira, and desires for this child to become an Athenian citizen. The child is actually named Pericles. And actually goes before the Athenian assembly and asks for a special, basically, exception to his own law, so that the child that he's had with, again, the woman who's the love of his life, can become an Athenian citizen. Now, citizen women in Athens still suffer from a number of disabilities under Athenian law. It goes without saying that they cannot vote in assemblies, they cannot serve in juries, they cannot even bring cases in court unless they are represented by a male relative who functions as a kurios, and this could be a husband or father and brother, has to deal with their legal matters for them. It seems to be very difficult to the point of impossible for an Athenian woman to initiate a divorce. In order to do so, she has to leave the house, which is something that respectable women do not like to be seen outside of the house. She has to go and personally petition the magistrates for a divorce. And all her husband has to do is stop her, is physically intercept her and bring her back. In fact, we're told that the wife of Alcibiades, one of the prominent generals during the Peloponnesian War, his wife wants a divorce, she runs down to the Agora looking for the magistrates, and Alcibiades simply intercepts her and physically, essentially restrains her and brings her back to his house, and she's unsuccessful in obtaining the divorce. It's very, very easy, suffice to say, for Athenian men to obtain a divorce should they desire one. Now, Athenian women can technically own property, but they also don't have a lot of control over their property. Now, the primary property that is associated with an Athenian woman is her dowry. This is oftentimes substantial. It's given at the time of marriage, and it seems that even relatively poor Athenian citizens, because they wish to appear respectable, will try to provide a dowry for their daughter at the time of marriage. Now, the dowry is technically the wife's. Presumably, it's managed by the husband, but it is hers. If the marriage ends, it goes back to her family. And if at the time of death, the dowry gets passed to her children. Now, it's her property, but again, she really does nothing to control it. It's simply a sort of property that's associated with her, and it goes where she goes. Now, the other way in which an Athenian woman comes by property is inheritance. And Athenians prefer to split the property up between brothers, but sometimes there aren't any brothers. Either the family only has girls, or the brothers predecease the parents, which is probably not uncommon. And so it may happen that a daughter inherits the family property. Now, Athenian law really provides no mechanism for women to control the property that they own. They cannot buy and they cannot sell. There is supposedly an Athenian law that prevents a woman from engaging in any commercial transaction that is valued more than one medimnos, one measure of grain. So women can buy and sell small things, but they're not allowed to, say, move around real estate. Now, this creates a problem. What happens when you have a woman who's inherited a family estate? The Athenians call these women epikleroi. Sometimes you'll see this translated heiresses, but essentially it's someone who has an estate, a woman who has an estate, and yet really does not have the legal capacity to manage this estate. The Athenian solution is to marry her to a close relative, the closest male relative on her father's side. In some instances, this would involve a father's brother marrying his niece. The Athenians do not consider this incest. It equally could be a sister's son or a brother's son of the father, so marrying a cousin on the father's side. And the goal, it seems, is to now attach the property to a man who has the legal capacity to engage in transactions that is protected by Athenian law, and B, keep the property within the family. So the restrictions on the ability of Athenian women to really control their property is in some ways quite remarkable, especially by the standards even of the contemporary Mediterranean. Spartan women can indeed inherit property and then control that property. The same very much goes for Roman women. And indeed, it seems elsewhere in ancient Greece, women can engage in large-scale commercial transactions so long as they have a male kurios to essentially vouch for those transactions. So in Athens, in democratic Athens, it seems women face special disabilities on their property rights. Now, this is all pretty grim. If there is one area where women in Athens have a significant outlet for personal and public expression, it would be religion. Now, one thing that we talked about way back in those good old days when we still met together in a single room was how the structure of the Greek Pantheon actually has a significant amount of appeal to women. And actually, when you think about it, this differs from the structure of modern Christianity and Judaism and Islam, where the Godhead everywhere is always male. In Greek religion, there are a number of female divinities. If we take the trio of Artemis, Aphrodite, and Hera, we have there capitulated the life cycle of a Greek woman. Artemis representing the prepubescent, the pre-reproductive phase of a girl's life. Aphrodite, the goddess of not just sex and love, but also of childbirth, representing the reproductive phase of a woman's life. And then Hera, actually the queen of the gods, representing the post-reproductive phase of a woman's life. Equally compelling to women was certainly the myth and the figures of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter being a goddess closely associated with agriculture, fertility, fecundity, and yet the central myth of Demeter is the grief that she feels when her daughter Persephone, oftentimes called Kore, maiden, is taken in marriage. It's just in the myth it's a kidnapping, but it's fundamentally about the marriage of the daughter to Hades, the king of the underworld, and the profound grief that Demeter feels at this loss. And certainly in this myth, we have encapsulated in some ways the trauma of a girl's marriage, the trauma of leaving her house at a very young age, probably in her early to middle teens, the trauma of moving in with a strange and possibly malevolent new male figure, and even the grief of the mother of losing her daughter to the new household in a Greek marriage. I mean, this is a mythic structure and mythic divine figures that I think very much appeal to women and speak to the at times traumatic realities of everyday life for women in classical Greece. Now, women, particularly in Athens, are to a degree secluded or sequestered. Respectable women stay in their house and are seldom seen engaged in public business. Religion, therefore, also represents a much welcome chance for women to get out of the house and to be involved in the wider community. Now, there are three big religious moments that allow Athenian women to get out of the house. The first, which is predominantly targeted at pubescent women, women coming of age, is the rural festival at Brauron, a festival to Artemis, in which girls, and to actually a lesser extent boys, come from all over Athens to the western part of Athens. And possibly the girls engage in some kind of skit or performance or ritual in which they imitate being bears. This is a ritual we don't know much about, but it's clearly a coming-of-age ritual. It's associated with Artemis, again, this figure frozen just at the cusp of puberty, and it's an important ritual that girls, again, probably between the ages of 10 and 13, engage with at Brauron. Now, another ritual in which Athenian women take part in and actually get to leave the house is the Thesmophoria. This is a 3-day festival that is basically exclusively for women, and it is a festival that is in honor of Demeter. So again, ties actually into this goddess who is quite important for, important for everyone, but also it seems to hold special weight for women. And this is a chance for women to exit the house, engage in processions, engage in sacrifice and feasting, and to actually contribute to the religious nature of the wider community. Finally, it's important that Athens, perhaps the most misogynistic of all Greek city-states, it's ironic that Athens, its patron deity is a goddess. It's Athena. And women do have an important role in honoring Athena. Many women take part in the Panathenaic Procession. Indeed, the Panathenaic Procession seems to form kind of the who's who of sisters and wives and daughters of the Athenian elite. And collectively, the women come together and weave a ritual covering for Athena, the peplos, which, having woven the peplos together, they then carry it to drape it around the cult statue of Athena. So in religion, women not only have a chance to get outside the house, they also have a chance to make what is seen as a critical contribution to the well-being of the community. All right, this has been a bit of a long lecture. That's all for today. Next week we will return to Athens in the 5th century as a geopolitical power and the lead up towards the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. I'll see you next week.